The truth is relative. Friedrich Schlegel. Idealism is based on the principle that the mind has a great bearing on how we experience reality. How do we get to speak about and describe reality, let alone experience it? We all agree that reality exists and that it's not just a matter of words. But what is it really? And if our minds alter the reality we think we know, what is it beyond the mind's representation of it? In the 17th century, Irish philosopher George Berkeley said that there is no such thing as matter or a material world. This is because what we call matter is nothing but an idea in our heads, hence idealism. It may be better expressed as ideaism. Berkeley was ruthlessly mocked by one and all, particularly by hardline materialists. Now, after decades of exploration into the quantum universe, skeptics, physicalists, and reductionists are forced to accept that the principles of idealism are correct. Because it has been scientifically proven beyond all doubt that what we call matter and reality is indeed altered by he who observes it, materialism is rendered null and void for all time. That is the major change in the zeitgeist of our times. Papers have gone flying and there's a lot of bummed folks out there licking their wounds. Of course, the revival of idealism has enormous ramifications for many areas of life. All sorts of cherished scientific paradigms, such as classical physics and neuroscience, are undergoing major revisions as I write. Reality is mind-dependent after all, like Berkeley, Blake and many other sages of the past said, only to be ridiculed and professionally assassinated, all in the name of a lie. Since it appears that we cannot penetrate into the mysteries of matter and of creation, many are inclined to take refuge in skepticism. In fact, skepticism has been around since Plato's age, maybe even before. Later in history, skepticism seemed validated by the discoveries and statements of Immanuel Kant. He too believed that since ultimate reality is permanently screened and off limits to human reason, what we call philosophy is not as unshakably founded and valid as we like to believe. Although most of Kant's statements were proven false, the world carried on as if nothing happened. Kant's startling announcements were taken on board and the insightful criticisms of his opponents, countering skepticism, were misrepresented and largely forgotten. It has had dreadful consequences for Western civilization and has allowed all sorts of absurd movements and notions to thrive for far too long. Shortly after Kant's time, in Germany of the late 18th century, a major schism occurred between those affected and disaffected by the Kantian project. The Romantics held that if the absolute has hidden aspects, and if its nature can only be approximated, why think about it at all? In their minds, questions of unshakable first principles and a transcendent source of knowledge were absurdities. This was due to their reading of Kant. Also, because being precedes self-consciousness, the case for being's elusiveness is rendered a certainty. Therefore, it follows that since we cannot have direct and complete knowledge of being, why indulge in philosophy at all? It leads only to nonsense, said the Romantics. Let's direct attention and effort to purely human affairs and dump the metaphysics. This edict was proposed, of course, in the name of freedom. Fichte, Hölderlin, Schelling and Hegel vehemently disagreed and had actively attempted to save Western philosophy from collapsing into insignificance at the hands of skeptics and romantics. Although the Romantics were seen as little more than revolutionaries and libertines, there were a few areas of agreement between the two contingents. Both agreed that history is an important factor. Indeed, it was at this time that history was first introduced as philosophically important. For the Romantics, history was important, but it must not be absolutized or necessarily connected with any transcendent principle. It is not a manifestation of the absolute, and is not, therefore, a central pillar of philosophy upon which certain knowledge stands. History merely records human activity and is not to be equated with spirit or Geist. Hegel disagreed. History is very definitely to be equated with Geist, and since the word also connotes mind, we see the deep connections between the movement of the divine spirit and human reason. If they are not, says Hegel, one and the same, they are very closely related, and not just linguistically. It follows that by studying one, we study and uncover truths about the other. This is the first principle that grounds and makes sense of philosophy. We philosophize because we can, because spirit has endowed us with the capacity to do so. However, despite the mind's present abilities, the fact remains that until we attain full self-consciousness, we will not find ourselves capable of understanding spirit. For Hegel and the other idealists, it is therefore essential that the lineaments of self-consciousness are examined and explained, along with speculations of a metaphysical nature. Any and all questions about the nature and purpose of spirit are inseparable, and inquiries into the mind posing said questions. Philosophy is inseparable from psychology. Our ability to self-reflexively observe our minds with the mind is no insignificant feat or accidental byproduct of physical evolution. It is an unexplained mystery and reason enough for philosophy. Philosophy's foremost task is to explain how and why we get from unconsciousness to self-consciousness states of being. What explains how we slowly pass through these three main stages and numerous sub-stages between to successfully arrive where we are. Along with this extraordinary capacity for self-awareness, we can, via reason, access the mind of spirit, as it were, or better said, we deduce the identity and purpose of spirit. What we call history is the history of this unfolding process whereby man acquaints himself with the nature of the divine. How is it, Hegel demanded, that this cannot be a legitimate first principle? How can we not ground thought in this principle? Those who deny it are insane and dangerous. Do they believe we can go through life without a modicum of self-consciousness? Do they believe we are identical in this regard to animals? That we are rational beings stands, said the idealists, as proof of the existence and immanence of spirit. Reason is, therefore, to be elevated to a first principle upon which all philosophizing and knowledge rest. The precept constitutes the heart of Western culture and the Western mystical tradition. For the idealists, reason is the bridge between the human and the divine. They denied the skepticism of Kant and set out to find better ways to prove the connection. For the Romantics and their progeny, reason evolved by way of a series of accidents and mutations. Spirit is just an empty term, a figment of language with no inherent substance or meaning. We waste precious time and resources taking it seriously. There is so many important social matters to attend to. Should we wish to entertain heady thoughts and ruminations, let us focus on art, music, drama, criticism, and literary pursuits. If I disagree over a poem, I can express my points in journals, magazines, public debates, and speeches. This is what practical reason is for, not abstraction and metaphysics. Tragically, the approach and doctrine of the Romantics did not fade away. It continued to be pervaded by bohemians, socialists, revolutionaries, anarchists, and artists right up to the present day. The Romantic doctrine spread far and wide, influencing Feuerbach, Marx, Engels, and almost every thinker and writer of the modern and postmodern periods. It certainly influenced Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and in later times influence can be detected in thinkers such as Berlin, Russell, Moore, Wittgenstein, Popper, Foucault, Derrida, Rorty, and other of their kind. The few who championed idealism were cast aside and forgotten. Hegel has been shamelessly dragged through the mud. There has been a long-standing campaign to misrepresent his profound corpus. From an unparalleled scribbler of nonsense, Arthur Schopenhauer on Hegel. If I were to say that the so-called philosophy of this fellow Hegel is a colossal piece of mystification, which will yet provide posterity with the inexhaustible theme for laughter at our times, that is a pseudo-philosophy paralysing all mental powers, stifling all real thinking, and, by the most outrageous misuse of language, putting in its place the hollowest, most senseless, thoughtless, and is confirmed by its success, most stupefying verbiage. I should be quite right. Further, what was senseless and without meaning at once took refuge in obscure exposition and language. Fichte was the first to grasp and make vigorous use of this privilege. Schelling, at least, equalled him in this, and a host of hungry scribblers without intellect or honesty soon surpassed them both. But the greatest effrontery in serving up sheer nonsense, in scrabbling together senseless and maddening webs of words, such as had previously been heard in madhouses, finally appeared in Hegel. It became the instrument of the most ponderous and general mystification that has ever existed, with a result that will seem incredible to posterity and be a lasting monument of German stupidity. Bertrand Russell was a tad more generous in his scathing diatribes against Hegel and German idealism. Nevertheless, he had as much contempt for idealism as his predecessor. In the early 20th century, positivists overthrew the school of British idealism. Men such as Karl Popper, Bertrand Russell, J. L. Austin, A. J. Ayer, and G. E. Moore spent their time debunking idealism. They carried on where the German romantics left off. There can be no doubt that they attempted to dismantle the entire Western tradition and undermine the core precepts of German mysticism and idealism, cleverly replacing the ideas of the idealists with more mundane ones pertaining to the value of art, drama, literature, liberalism, revolution, and self-expression had universal appeal. Such ideas were accepted to bohemians, malcontents, and artists far and wide. This accounts for entire genres of art such as Impressionism, Expressionism, Abstractionism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Modernism. Artists, writers, and filmmakers such as James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, Max Ernst, André Breton, Jean-Luc Godard, F.T. Martinelli, Salvador Dali, Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, Konstantin Brancusi, Le Corbusier, Andy Warhol, Jackson Pollock, Damien Hirst, and many others, to various degrees encapsulated the principles of the Romantics in their works. The transgressive ideas of the Romantics culminated in Germany in the so-called Weimar Republic, the antitype of later debauched hedonistic communities and societies. Without the excess of the Weimar, there could be no Amsterdam, Reeperbahn, Christiania, Soho or Greenwich Village, no hippie movement, Berkeley, Woodstock, Burning Man, or the LGBTQ fiasco. There'd be no drag queens on parade, no cross-dressing extravaganzas, no political correctness, no entitled half-wits, drug culture, or drug epidemics laying waste to the West. More to the point, there'd be no communism, cultural Marxism, pluralism, multiculturalism, feminism, or relativism. Not outside a lunatic asylum, that is. We think it's all new, something of our times. Actually, most of the sick aspects of Western culture seen today derive from Germany of the 1790s. It was Germany's and Europe's fin de siècle, with characteristic upheavals. Although the two great wars hadn't happened, Europe had experienced the Industrial Revolution and French Reign of Terror, the Franco-Prussian War, the rise of Napoleon and French invasion of Europe. Republicans challenged monarchies and many an old order was brought to the brink. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, dismay swept Europe. Liberal thinkers everywhere and every champion of liberty, fraternity and equality was plunged into despair. Hopes for a better tomorrow were dashed, and many disgruntled types like Shelley, Bakunin, Proudhon, Kropotkin, Trotsky and Marx were even more determined to smash the old order. It was these times that witnessed the rise of extremist socialism and philosophical relativism. There's nothing new under the sun. Today's media talking heads rarely, if ever, speak of this. The average millennial has no clue where it all began and where his vagrant ideas come from. The German Romantics were akin to today's millennials. They were the young hipsters of their age, of the fin de siècle. They were philosophical lightweights who envied the great thinkers of their time. As far as they were concerned, ideas were rotten just because they were old. They were to be trashed just because they were taught by goat-bearded fuddy-duddies in universities. These young student upstarts were offended by the elusiveness of spirit. If Geist cannot be delivered upon a silver plate, it's not worth our time. Let's get on with self-expression, social reform, and having fun. The Dionysian horde, opium pipes in hand, stormed the streets and colleges, preaching radicalism and anarchy. Certainty is what we make it. Let's not wait for a God to rescue us. In their drug-drenched ardour, the Romantics committed themselves to utopian ideals. Today, the technocrat executes their mandate to build a better world. However, because their premises are absurd, they've delivered nothing less than a dystopia. But where is the pushback? Who speaks against it? Why are the warnings of the few enemies of progress unable to get a decent hearing? Taking his cue from his mentor Samuel Taylor Coleridge, English philosopher and linguist Owen Barfield sought to resolve the breach between romantics and idealists. He acknowledged the good in both camps and also the flaws. Coleridge, one of England's foremost poets, had travelled to Germany to get as close as possible to the men involved in arguments and critiques about Kant's sceptical philosophy. He listened to both contingents and made up his own mind about Kant's extraordinary proposals about consciousness and reality. They were wrong, thought Coleridge. He aligned himself instead with the philosophy of nature as espoused by Friedrich Schilling. Indeed, Coleridge was soon given the title, the English Schelling. In his youth, Schelling was a fellow traveller of the Romantics and had a lot of time for some of their ideas, particularly those celebrating the classical period and Middle Ages. However, in the end he could not stomach their sneering dismissal of the relevance of philosophy. Although poetry and politics were not unimportant, there was no way they were to be exalted above philosophy. That was tantamount to extreme libertinism and amounted to the undermining of the entire Western tradition. Schelling tried to bring the Romantics to their senses, but it proved useless. He sided with his unshakable friend, Friedrich Hölderlin, and condemned the high-sounding Romantic doctrine in writing and speeches. Coleridge and Barfield took a similar view. Despite the appeal of some Romantic ideas, those which inspired Shelley and other English poets, Romanticism's project was ultimately wrong-headed. It could only lead to cultural chaos. Barfield, however, hesitated before subscribing to the tenets of absolute idealism espoused by Fichte and Hegel. Nature was definitely a first principle and was to be taken as the signature of the absolute. History was also undoubtedly the process by which Geist or spirit moves towards full self-realization. And there can be no doubt that reason is a special endowment to man, that it indicates the benevolence of the divine. However, despite the veracity of these idealist principles, there was still the problem of radical skepticism to be addressed. If any part of being or spirit lies in darkness, if some part of the divine remains elusive, then it follows that, as Kant first enunciated, reason is not enough. This in turn means that the search for metaphysical knowledge is bound to be limited. Maybe then the Romantics and Libertines had a point. Why bother philosophizing at all? A decision one way or the other seemed impossible. Kant offered faith and belief as the way out. If I have faith in something, I'm no longer in need of proofs for and against. I save myself from the never-ending round of heady intellectual critiques. Barfield focused on this problem of being's elusiveness. He didn't object to it. Like Hölderlin and Rilke, he said that it should be revered and embraced as the foremost foundational principle of thought and philosophy. Barfield wholeheartedly agreed, thus he was more of an idealist than a romantic. We are to be all right with being's elusiveness. The poet needs to change his disposition in terms of it, and so does the philosopher. Indeed, this is exactly the position taken by Barfield's German contemporary Martin Heidegger. There are interesting parallels between the ideas of the two men. Both revered Hölderlin and Schelling, and for good reason. Like Heidegger, Barfield also implicitly remarked on the antipathy caused in humans by the elusiveness of being. Knowledge is based on understanding, standing under, which implies that there is something to be understood. Being precedes self-consciousness and cannot, therefore, be understood in a conventional sense. Being understands all things, including human consciousness. In language, being appears in the form of the ubiquitous is. It is raining outside. The tree is in the garden. The meal is ready. Tomorrow is Saturday. It is a good feeling, etc. Being is there, at the base of everything, especially when we aren't aware of it. As far as Fichte was concerned, since human beings ask the question of being and represent it in their language and speech, as is, being and self are intimately connected. They may even be one and the same. When I ask questions about the sun and moon or inquire into the nature of a river, cloud or tulip, it is not the same as asking about being. When I ask about objects and entities in the world around me, I can come upon my answers without too much trouble. Moreover, my discoveries about tulips isn't relevant to my status as a being. If, on the other hand, I inquire into the mystery of being, what I discover has the greatest impact on me as a being. Conversely, questions about myself are simultaneously relevant to the nature of being. For this reason, Fichte saw the self as inseparable from being. The connection and relationship between the two is clearly a first principle of philosophy. Questions about being are born from wonder. But if being is so insignificant and inherently meaningless, why would it ever become an object of thought and wonder? Why would our language be replete with it? To reduce the concept of being is to reduce selfhood to nothingness. To wonder at the mystery of being is to be able to wonder, which in turn means being is a matter for us. Wonder is a response to it. Can this occur unless we, on some level, recognise being's presence, however elusive it is? Being and wonder are therefore one and the same, just as being and self are one and the same. Take being out of the equation, and we are left not without philosophy, but simple narcissism. Perhaps not enough of that to even ask, who am I? Remember that the object of all knowledge is self-revelation. Our questions about the external world of objects and entities are for the purpose of establishing the not I, all in the service of a better definition of I. Strangely, there is also, as said, a feeling of animosity towards the mystery of being. Instead of being an object of wonder, the hiddenness of being offends us. So much so that almost everything we see in our world derives from it. Instead of reverence, we respond with hubris and rage to mystery. This animosity towards nature and being accounts for the rise of science, technology, and religion. It's the reason techne has superseded physis. Science, technology, and religion cannot be understood without an understanding of the non-conscious animosity towards the unconditioned. Barfield also thought that evidence of this odd congenital hostility was to be found in our language. Human antipathy towards nature's mystery, the mystery of mystery, gave rise to romanticism and relativism. Almost every writer on romanticism states that it was simply a branch of idealism, and that the ideas of the two schools at Jena had a lot in common. This is simply not so. Schelling and Hegel were deeply involved in the debates of the time. Their teacher, Johann Fichte, had come under ferocious attack from his young histrionic pupils who founded the Romantic movement. They too were hotly debated and mocked. Indeed, the lampooning of Hegel never abated. It continues to this day, while detractors ransack his great work, scavenging parts they redact and use to further their own worthless reputations. Hegel fought valiantly against Western civilization's destroyers. His work is to be understood in this light. The phenomenology of spirit is a manual of idealism, yes. It is also a defence against the onslaught of the Romantics. For this reason alone, it must be treasured for all time. Fichte, Hölderlin, Schelling and Hegel refused to follow the doctrines of Romanticism. If the absolute is inaccessible, and if our knowledge of it is inadequate and faulty, don't blame the absolute and remove it from the rightful pedestal. Blame humanity. It is we who haven't got it right. It is we whose metaphysical speculations are wanting. Hegel's attitude was optimistic and positive. Don't scrap what great men of the past said about reality. Don't abjure and replace philosophy. Accept its limitations and start again. Science concedes that it has been forced to do this many times, as paradigms fall and get abandoned. So let us do likewise and let the phoenix rise from the ashes of the old. Let what is past nourish the new. Any other approach is absurd and leads only to irreverence, apathy, hedonism, and despoliation. No, said Hegel, let's work to establish new foundations for philosophy. To use his own nomenclature, let us negate the negation and build a new thesis. Long live the dialectic.